Why did cavalry move away from the heavy lance and move to mostly swords instead? I'm here with Zach Evans. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here with my friend Zach Evans. Check out his channel, I've linked it down below. So Zach was coming over today and he had a question for me, and this is not planned out, so we're going to see where this takes us. But Zach had a question for me about, well, you can ask the question.
Okay, so I sometimes do question times on my channel, and one of the questions that came up was, why did cavalry move away from the lance and towards, well, ended up with swords like this one from World War One? Why would you do that? You know, a lance has got great reach. It does the job. It was used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Why did they do it? So we both got some ideas. You hit me with one.
So the first thing that, when you asked me the question, was, well, lances didn't disappear. Yeah. so lances very much stayed in use. And, you know, in World War One, which was the last major war where we saw extensive cavalry actions, both on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, down in the Middle East, all over. So contrary to lots of people's perceptions, you think about planes and tanks. I've spoken about this a lot on the channel. There was a lot of cavalry action, and particularly in 1918 as well, actually, when the war became a bit more mobile again. And the British actually used cavalry in conjunction with tanks. So at the Battle of Cambrai, for example, the plan was for the tanks in 1917, the tanks to break through the German lines, and then the British cavalry were going to pour through and exploit this and attack basically behind the enemy lines, attack fleeing, the idea of, you know, the fleeing enemy, and chase after them and attack artillery emplacements, this kind of stuff. It didn't actually pan out like that, but there were some things which kind of worked later on in the war. Now, lances were used, so absolutely the British cavalry still had lancers to some extent, and had lancers since the Napoleonic Wars. Now, funnily enough, in the Napoleonic Wars, the British didn't have lancers. We'd abandoned lancers, and we came a cropper against Napoleon's lancers, particularly the Polish lancers at Waterloo and elsewhere. And so just after the Napoleonic Wars, the British Army readopted lancers again. Yeah. So some of the light dragoons and hussars were turned into lancer regiments in, I think, 1816, I think the year after the war ended. Yeah. And then famously, the charge of the Light Brigade involved, the Light Brigade was both light cavalry with swords, but also light cavalry with lancers as well. And then there was the charge of the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. So certainly in British circles, and certainly in the French and Polish and other armies, Lancers had featured prominently. But what had disappeared was the heavy lance, wasn't it? So the heavy lance, which obviously you've got lots of experience with, that was used in jousting, that was used by knights on the battlefield for well, a few centuries, seems to have faded out kind of in the 17th century in Western Europe anyway, didn't it?
Yeah. So and that really matches with, why is the heavy lance being used? Because they did use light lances in the medieval period as well, but they used them for different things. And the heavy lance was really an armour-piercing weapon. And in the 17th century, they had something better for that. So at this point, you don't see the lance being replaced by a sword, because they're all still carrying swords. You see it replaced with a pistol. Yeah,
not necessarily a 19th century Adams revolver like this, but this is just representative of the fact that cuirassiers in the 17th century, so by the time of the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War, very often carried a sword and a pair of pistols. Yeah. Or a carbine as well. Yeah. And I think this is really super important on a number of levels, because firstly, there are things that the lance does, or is supposed to do, penetrating opponent's armour and, you know, being an ultimately powerful weapon, which now this is better at doing that, isn't it?
Absolutely. All of the advantages of the lance, of the heavy cavalry lance, we should say, are enhanced in a pistol. It's got greater armour piercing, it's got longer range. Yep. You don't even need to close in order to get it. You can carry multiple with you. Because that's the other thing, the heavy lance, once it's skewered someone, it's unlikely to be coming out. The light lance, you move your arm to remove it from a dead person. The heavy lance, you can't do that because it's it's properly couched under your arm in order to get through the armour.
Yeah. And you know, another point when we were chatting before we turned the camera on, another point that came to me as well was that something else came about in the 16th century, which is really when wheel-lock pistols start to appear, that really changed the nature of things, and that was pike blocks.
Yeah.
So you know, we often refer to the 17th century as the age of pike and musket. So if you're a cavalryman operating in the age of pike and musket, well, who are you going to attack with your lance? You're either going to attack the guys with muskets. Well, okay, that's fine, but you can do that just as well with a sword.
Yeah.
They don't have bayonets yet as well, bear in mind. Or you're going to attack the pike block. Well, attacking a pike block on horseback, well, the pike block literally exists to nullify cavalry. They're there to protect the musketeers.
And they did try and solve that. They did increase the length of the heavy cavalry lance, and they did drill on blocking pikes and moving them away. The Polish lancers were responsible for breaking several pike blocks. So it was possible, but it was just so much
they used
easier.
like you said, they used particularly long lances. Yeah. And they wore armour, which to some extent, you know, some of the pikes, I guess, will slide off you, but not necessarily off the horse. But ultimately, for most people, most of the time, without any particular training, apart from how to reload your pistol, it is easier to, as a cavalryman, ride up to the pike block, go bang, bang, and then ride away, reload, and repeat, rinse and repeat.
Absolutely.
So it's you know, and the pike block are, I mean, okay, they might have breastplates and helmets some of the time, which might be bulletproof certainly pistol proof to a degree. But if you hit them anywhere else, they're going to now be a wounded pikeman. Yeah. And you can just keep doing that as cavalry. You can go up again and again and again.
No risk to yourself.
No, and you know, so even if we fast forward to the age of muskets and bayonets, you know, the Battle of Waterloo, the French cuirassiers, they did deliver charges with the sword, but they also rode up to the English lines, to the English squares, fired both their pistols in, and then rode off again to reload. You know that. So that is far more effective than trying to ram into a body of men who are either shooting at you or have long pole arms to stab you back. So I kind of think there's two things going on here. One, the availability of firearms, and then the fact that infantry tactics and weaponry, i.e. the pike block and later on the bayonet, kind of nullifies the lance's benefits.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned it in a video, in my question time video, but I think it's worth putting in here as well. Both of these weapons, the cavalry sword and the pistol, are just easier to carry. And so once you get to a point where you have professional soldiers instead of nobility with a baggage train, it's just so much easier to have weapons that you can strap to your body. Yeah,
so that's for me, that's the secondary question, and that's something that's come up in questions on my channel quite often. It's like, why didn't 19th century cavalrymen all have lances? Because by and large, a lance, even the light lance, is a better weapon most of the time than a sword. The only real exception to that is when you get into a melee. And cavalry tried not to do that. They tried to hit and run. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you get into a squish, if you get into a press, or if you're trying to wound multiple people as quickly as possible, like when they charged the Russian guns at Battle of Balaclava, then a sword might be better than a lance, because you can lay about you and put a whole load of people out of action quite quickly. It's like having a revolver rather than having a shotgun, I guess. But here's the thing. So by the 18th and 19th century, a lot of cavalry also operate as mobile riflemen and musket troops, dragoons essentially. So the whole original idea of the dragoon was someone who could ride quickly, a bit like a tank, ride quickly to an area, dismount, shoot at an enemy, then mount up and ride off again. So not even shooting from horseback, they dismount and shoot a lot of the time, because you could reload more quickly on foot and you could shoot more accurately on foot and then move off. Here's the thing, if you've got a lance, that is a real pain in the butt to do. Because what do you do with the lance while you're reloading your gun? Whether it's a pair of pistols, or whether it's a carbine or a rifle or a musket, it's a lot easier to have a firearm or a pair of firearms and a sword than to have firearms and a lance. So for that reason, they did actually give lancers pistols, and they did have ways of slinging the lance, but by and large, lancers weren't very good at providing fire at the enemy, whereas other types of, dragoon and stuff were, I think, better at it, because they weren't trying to manage a great long 10-foot long bamboo lance.
Absolutely. I think whenever you improve a weapon in one particular way, it makes it worse at something else.
Yeah.
And the lance has been created to create huge amounts of power on a very small point in one plane for a very specific thing, which is the cavalry charge. And in almost every other situation, there's something else that does it better.
Yeah.
So in a cavalry charge, a lance would be brilliant, but that is the smallest, and most cavalry
and good against other cavalry.
Yeah. But most cavalry might not even be in one cavalry charge in a year.
No,
where they would use a
lance.
lance. They would be used for so many more things, and so a wider array of weapons that can be suited to those things. And let's face it, even battle. I know we're talking about soldiers, but battle is the smallest amount of the time that you're actually out on campaign. Yeah,
patrolling, scouting, reconnaissance is most of what you're doing. And
so having something really long, if you're scouting on reconnaissance, easier to spot.
Absolutely.
When they were moving about, they would often trail their lances along the ground, so that they wouldn't show high up in the air. The other thing is that even the light ones are quite heavy. Just throwing in loads of stuff. Even the light ones are quite heavy unless you hold them completely upright.
Certainly, I mean, a heavy lance is a great big piece of timber, isn't it? And even, I guess, some of the lightest lances that have ever been made are the 19th century bamboo lances, but even they're a fair weight, and they're inconvenient. Like you say, they get tangled in things. If you're riding through a wooded area or jungle or anything like that, they're just going to get in the way. If you dismount, if your job is patrolling an area or policing a territory, which is what a lot of cavalry did, you go into a village, you dismount, you go into some buildings to, collect taxes or do whatever you're there to do. A lance is a real nuisance thing to, what do you do with it? Whereas a sword, you just stick it in the scabbard, and it's useful inside a building, which a lance usually isn't, and all that kind of stuff. So for general life purposes, I think a sword does the job well enough and is more versatile in some ways than a lance is. And you've got these. So there we go. Have we missed anything? I guess that's. I'm sure there's some things we might have overlooked.
But we could stay here all night.
But I should mention this isn't either of us, I think, like bad mouthing lances, because we both have huge respect for lances. Clearly, you've spent a lot of your life using lances, probably far more than swords, actually. And I'm, as you know, I'm a massive fan of all types of pole arms, and I would definitely like to have a lance on horseback, just for the reach advantage, if nothing else, and penetrative power. What a lance will go through far exceeds what a sword will generally go through. So, anyway, an interesting topic. What have we missed? What do you disagree with? What do you agree with? And any other questions that might be related to this for future videos. Zach, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Check out Zach's channel, link down below. And I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Bye-bye.